Seth, Dreams and Projection of Consciousness by Jane Roberts. Introduction by Robert F. Butts. Published in 1987 by Still Point Publishing. Read by Martin John. Part 1. Intrusions from the Interior. Continuation Part 1, Number 3. Introduction of Seth. Further steps into the interior universe. During the rest of that September in 1963, I reread the Idea Construction manuscript many times, trying to understand it and hoping to recapture some of the feelings I had during its delivery. Now and then, flashing insights came to me in response. But more often than not, I just sat there, frustrated. My intellect just could not get beyond certain points, and I knew it. Suddenly, however, I entered a period of intense creative activity, ending a dry spell that had lasted for nearly a year. Ideas for poetry, in particular, came so quickly that I hardly had time to write them down. It wasn't too difficult to trace most of these to the Idea Construction manuscript. Also, I began a new book. Because of the Miss Cunningham dream and the Idea Construction experience, Rob suggested that I try some experiments in ESP and expansion of consciousness and do a book on the results, negative or positive. Those of you who have read my two other books in this field know that the experiments were astonishingly successful and led, through the Ouija board, to our first contact with Seth. I've described those early sessions elsewhere, but I'm including, instead, a poem that is a dramatic, intuitive statement about my feelings at the time. Actually, several episodes are condensed into one in the poem. Seth didn't really announce himself until we had worked with the Ouija board 4 times. And it was in the middle of the 8th session that I began to speak for him. Almost from the beginning, however, I did anticipate what the board was going to say, and the poem is as valid as any strictly factual statement I could make about those sessions, if not more so. Poem. The Visitor. We tried the Ouija board one night, my husband Rob and I. The cat sat on the bright blue rug. Hot coffee bubbled on the stove. "This thing will never work," I said. "We must be out of our minds." But we weren't, at least not yet. The cat smiled but didn't say anything. Then the little pointer moved as if 1,000 molecules grew legs and carried it upon their backs, lightning fast across the board. "You're moving it," I shouted. "Hon, that isn't fair." "What a riot!" I tried to laugh. "I'm not doing it," Rob said. "You may call me Seth," the letters spelled. Rob looked up but didn't speak. The cat strolled about in the warm lamplight. "The coffee must be done," I cried. I ran into the kitchen. "Do you want some now?" Rob shook his head. "There's something that wants you back at the board. You'd better sit down again." I stared at him. He meant it. I knew him well enough to know. I said as defiantly as I could, "It's only a game. Besides, we don't know any Seth." But my mind felt crowded out of itself, by thoughts not its own, as if someone were settling down in my skull, that I hadn't invited in. Then my visitor sat with my husband and smiled out through my eyes at the cat. With me out of the way, he seemed quite at home. "Good evening. I'm Seth." My lips spoke. He began walking my body about, as if getting accustomed to arms and legs. I'd never been so astonished to be locked out of myself like that. But he was benign and jovial as a bishop. Someone might ask in for an evening of tea, and when he let me peek out through his eyes, the familiar living room seemed very strange. Now, as seasons come and go, he visits twice a week, from worlds that have no wind or snow, but still have promises to keep. Actually, the board first gave a few messages from a personality called Frank Withers, who insisted that he had known our neighbor, Miss Cunningham. I didn't take this very seriously at first, but he also said that he knew an elderly woman who worked with me at a local art gallery where I had a part-time job. When questioned, this woman told me that she had known such a man, though he had merely been an acquaintance. This was enough to send me to Miss Cunningham's apartment, hoping to bring up the same name in conversation. I wasn't about to tell anyone about the Ouija board messages. It struck me odd, also, that Miss Cunningham would be in any way connected with our Ouija activities. This tie-in immediately reminded me of the July dream, of course. It was the first time Miss Cunningham and I had really talked together in some time, and I was shocked by this change in her. Her hair was unkempt. She plucked nervously at her dress. As she spoke, she would suddenly stop in the middle of a sentence, begin to hum a tune, and then would forget what she had said. The next moment, she would be herself again. Then the cycle began all over. "Did you ever know a Frank Withers?" I asked finally. "His name came up the other day. Someone said you knew him." Withers, she said. And off she went into a little tune. "Frank Withers?" I said, feeling guilty at disturbing her. Yes, her voice trailed off, disappeared and returned. "I had many students with that name. There were several." I waited for more. What were we saying? "Did you want something?" "How nice to see you," she said brightly. But already the opaqueness was ready to settle back, so I knew it was useless. Disquieted, I returned to my apartment. As the days passed, I was nervously aware of her, wandering through the hallways, and made it a point to look in on her now and then. But we were so taken up with our own affairs that we saw her infrequently. It was a strange time. The assassination of JFK took place just after our sessions began. The familiar physical world did not seem to be a very secure place. The old ways of thought were bringing appalling fruits. An uneasy December followed, bitter and dreary and discouraging on the national scene. And locally the weather was dark, with snow piled high, and yet, inside our small, lighted living room, we both felt we were making important inroads, gaining invaluable insights, and finding a point of sanity amid a chaotic world. In the meantime, we held our board sessions twice a week. By the time I returned from the art gallery on those winter afternoons, it was already dark. After supper, I did the dishes and worked on my poetry for an hour, and then Rob got out the board. Often these sessions lasted until midnight. Rob took verbatim notes from the beginning. Most of the first 10 sessions dealt with reincarnation and included some fascinating material on Rob's family. "They're great tales," I said. "I noticed we'd been using the insights about my parents and relating to them better than we ever did before," Rob said. "Sure, glad to," I said. "And reincarnation is a terrific theory to play around with. Remember my first published short story, Red Wagon, in Fantasy and Science Fiction, the magazine? It was based on reincarnation, but that doesn't mean that I believe in it or think it's true or fact." "Maybe underneath you knew it was true even then," Rob said. "Oh, hun," I retorted, with uneasy and quiet unconscious scorn. So the early sessions intrigued me, but, intellectually, I couldn't accept reincarnation. Interestingly enough, reincarnation wasn't a part of the idea construction of experience. Those ideas were embedded in me so thoroughly that I would never doubt them. By now, we were also trying other experiments for my book, which I was writing during the mornings. And in our 12th session, Seth gave what I still think of as a cornerstone that served as a preliminary framework on which the rest of the Seth material would be built. I've quoted parts of it in other books, yet the analogy Seth gave us is such an excellent introduction to the interior universe and to his ideas that it is almost indispensable. Each time I read it, I gain new insights. I had only begun speaking for Seth a few sessions earlier. Before the 8th session, all replies came through the board. The whole thing seemed so wild to me. "Just turning into something else like that?" I used to say. The session was held on the evening of January 2nd, 1964, and lasted 3 hours. We locked the door and closed the blinds, but always left the lights on for the sessions. We began this one with the Ouija board, but only after a few moments I shoved it aside and began dictating as Seth. Here's a brief excerpt from the 12th session. "As far as the 5th dimension is concerned, I've said that it is space. I will have to try to build up the image of a structure to help you understand, but then I must rip down the structure because there is none there. Consider, then, a network of wires somewhat like, though different from, Jane's conception of idea construction, a maze of interlocking wires endlessly constructed so that looking through them there would seem to be no beginning or end. Your plane could be likened to a small position between 4 very spindly and thin wires, and my plane could be likened to the small position in the neighboring wires on the other side. Not only are we on different sides of the same wires, but we are at the same time either above or below, according to your viewpoint. And if you consider the wires as forming cubes, then the cubes could also fit one within the other, without disturbing the inhabitants of either cube one iota. And these cubes are also within cubes, which are themselves within cubes. And I'm speaking now only of the small particles of space taken up by your plane and mine. Again, now think in terms of your plane, bounded by its small spindly set of wires, and my plane on the other side. These, as I have said, have also boundless solidarity and depth, yet in usual terms, to one side the other is transparent. You cannot see through, but the two planes move through each other constantly. I hope you see what I have done here. I have initiated the idea of motion, for true transparency is not the ability to see through, but to move through. This is what I mean by fifth dimension. Now remove the structure of the wires and cubes. Things behave as if the wires and cubes were there, but these are only constructions necessary, even to those on my plane, in order to make this comprehensible to our faculties, the faculties of any entity. We merely construct imaginary lines to walk upon. So real are the wall constructions of your room that you would freeze in winter time without them. Yet there is no room and no walls. So, in a like manner, the wires that we constructed are real to us in the universe, although, to me, the walls are transparent. So are the wires that we construct to make our point about the fifth dimension. But for all practical purposes, we must behave as if the wires were there. Again, if you will consider our maze of wires, I will ask you to imagine them filling up everything that is, with your plane and my plane like two small birds' nests in the net-like fabric of some gigantic tree. Consider, for example, that these wires are also mobile, constantly trembling and also alive, in that they not only carry the stuff of the universe, but are themselves projections of this stuff, and you will see how difficult it is to explain. Nor can I blame you for growing tired when, after asking you to imagine this strange structure, I then insist that you tear it apart, for it is no more actually seen or touched than is the buzzing of 1,000,000 invisible bees. "Let me read you some of the material you just dictated," Rob said, and he read several pages. Only a few excerpts were given here. "It makes more sense to me than anything I've ever read," I said. "But where did it come from? Now, in my ordinary state of consciousness, I can only appreciate it or even criticize it. The source is gone." "Is it?" Rob asked. "Or do you only permit it freedom, with great caution and under certain definite conditions?" When he said things like that, I'd get upset, and the familiar living room seemed strange. The table, chairs, the couch and rug look satisfyingly normal in the warm lamplight, yet I felt these shapes were highly significant, only intrusions of other realities that were invisible but always active. "If you were doing this instead of me," I said, "you'd be cautious too." But Rob only grinned. Would I? During all of this time, Rob and I were having our first experiences with mobility of consciousness. What else could consciousness do? What could mind do? The questions filled me with wonder, and we tried all kinds of experiments. One of the most fascinating was an experiment we tried alone one night. I'm including Rob's notes of it to give you an idea of the various things we were trying. I'm convinced that this sort of experience is most valuable and that it helped to shake our consciousness out of its usual focus in objective, ego-oriented reality. For me, the episode was amazingly vivid, the scenes clear and bright in my mind's eye. It was something like attending an inner movie, or, someone might say, like dreaming vividly while awake. But for me, then, it was simply a completely new state of consciousness and awareness, a psychological experience like none I'd known before. I'm rather embarrassed now by the fact that we turned the lights off, since our sessions and classes are always conducted in normal light. In those days, though, we didn't know how to proceed, and we had read that such affairs were conducted in near darkness. Rob and I sat at my wooden table with only a small electric candle lit. After quite some time, I began to see pictures, and as Rob took notes, I spoke aloud in my own voice, describing what I was seeing and experiencing. This was the resulting monologue. Quote, I see the name Sarah Wellington. She was in a cobbler's shop. It was 1748 in England. There were huge cowhides hanging up in the back room of the cobbler's shop and dried cowhides hanging in another room. It was very cold in there, where the first cowhides were. It wasn't ventilated, and there were no windows. There were windows in the front room, though, and benches and a stone floor. It was a stone house with a fireplace. September, damp and foggy in the afternoon, about 4 o'clock. Sarah Wellington was blonde. She had stringy hair. She wasn't very pretty, but bony. She was 17. Her parents weren't there, and Sarah didn't live there either. I paused. Rob waited for a few moments, wondering whether or not to interrupt me. Finally he asked quietly, Where did she live? 3 doors away. How long did she live? He asked. I paused again. Then I saw the whole thing very clearly, and I said, excited, She died at 17, there in the cobbler's shop. She died from burns. The cobbler came out of the back room, and there she was, all in flames and screaming. He shoved her out into the street and rolled her over and over on the stones and in the dirt, but she died. She lived 3 doors down the street in a dark front room. She had 2 brothers, one off someplace. He was a sailor. The other was younger. Sarah's father did something for the cobbler, and, in return, he made shoes for the younger brother, and Sarah was in the shop to get them. Another pause. What? Rob said. Can you make that clearer? It was a craft, I said. Something Sarah's father bartered for the shoes. Something to do with fishing nets. The village was right by the sea. The cobbler's shop was the only one around, though there were other villages. Sarah's father made fish nets out of seaweed, dried seaweed. They wove it together like rope, then made the nets. The fishermen had plain wooden boats and piles of fish on a good day. Black fish, some of them only a few inches long, some much longer, averaging maybe a foot in length. There was fishing all year long. It wasn't seasonal. The water was warm in the winter. That's why it was so foggy. They didn't farm too much because the ground was poor and rocky, very hilly, so they depended on fish. Do you know the name of the village? Rob asked. I had been seeing everything that I had been describing, and now the name just appeared in my head. Levenshire. It was fewer than 300 people, on the northeast coast of England. The people also got some of their food from another village further north. For some reason, the land was better there. I kept seeing more. I would think that I was telling Rob about each scene as I saw it, but then he would ask a question, and I'd realize that I hadn't said a word for some time. "What crops did they grow?" he asked, and I tried to rouse myself enough to keep on speaking while still retaining focus on these strange shifting scenes. "I see tomatoes, but even as I say that, it seems to me once that I read that people didn't eat tomatoes in those days. But yes, the people in the small villages did, and wheat and barley. They had cows. The cobbler was an old man. He was also the sexton of the small church, the Church of England. He used to ring the bells. His wife was 53, Anna. She wore glasses and had grayish-white hair and was very stout and messy. There was a boy in the shop, too, not their son, an apprentice to the cobbler. He slept in the kitchen. His name was Albert Lang. He was 11, I think. The cobbler and his wife had no children. She had trouble with her glasses. Most people didn't wear any. They were handmade. They had to grind the glass. They were like magnifying glasses in a frame on her nose. The cobbler was comparatively well off, though not wealthy. He was 53 when he died. The boy, Albert, was too young to take over the shop, and for a couple of years the village had no cobbler, and the boy was a fisherman. Then another cobbler came, and Albert helped out in the shop again. He finally married. His wife's name was also Sarah. She was a cousin of Sarah Wellington's. Most of the people in the village were related in one way or another. They had no other place to go. I stopped speaking again for a few minutes. I don't know if my eyes were open or closed, and, in any case, the room was so dark that Rob could just manage to see in order to make notes. All I saw were the vivid places and people, and I spoke in jerky, quick sentences, sometimes with no effort to make complete sentences. "What do you see now?" Rob asked. "The main street." I laughed out loud because I saw it so clearly. "I see houses and a couple of shops, then a narrow cobbled walk raised up high. It was a partly dirt road built up of rocks and stones that ran around an inlet from the sea, but it was never flooded. The road kept the village dry. There wasn't any sandy beach, though." "Would you know it if you saw it in physical life now? If you took a trip to England?" Rob asked. "No, it's not there now. I don't think I'd know the spot. It was just this little inlet, with the rocky hills and not much grass. It wasn't a seaport. Big ships couldn't get in close. There was just enough room for the little boats to go out for fish." My inner gaze traveled up the hills beyond the village. I felt myself climbing, but Rob interrupted. "How far was it from London?" And suddenly I knew the answer and saw a dark landscape from above. There were other flurries of images that I also described. It was 2 days overland by stage, 2 days by horseback. They made about 20 miles a day. They didn't like to travel after dark. It was too dangerous. There were too many robbers. So they always stayed at an inn that was about halfway there. It was called Sedgwick. They'd get there by the evening of the first day. In the inn there was a huge fireplace. Their dishes were made of earthenware. They had ale. It was served with meals. Their meat was ribs, mutton ribs, and something called Brausenswager. They had bread, barley bread and soup, fish soup and mussels. They didn't have salt. They had beans. I don't know what kind. They always carried pistols. The pistols were black and long, much longer than pistols today. There was a jigger at the top that they kept powder in. I don't know what for. Suddenly I started laughing. I was seeing this pistol very clearly, but I have absolutely no interest in guns and no knowledge of them at all, so it was difficult to explain how the pistol was made. I didn't know the names of the parts. It seemed incongruous that I could have a vision of such a simple object and then not have the vocabulary to describe it. Yet I seemed to know everything about the gun. Part of me was aware of the strangeness of the situation and of the flickering candlelight in which Rob was furiously taking notes. But another part of my consciousness was focused on the gun, and I was intent upon describing it as well as possible. They made bullets and put powder into them. The powder and the bullets were kept separate until they were put into the gun, though 1 or 2 bullets were always kept ready. They saved the bullets if they could find them after firing. The metal was hard to get. The guns were awfully heavy. These bullets were something new. They didn't last. They stopped making them. For some reason I don't understand, the bullets might explode. The men didn't want to keep the powder and bullets together. Sometimes the powder was rusty and sometimes whitish. They were big bullets. One of the reasons the guns were so large. The people didn't go to London often. Some never went at all. The first Sarah, who died at 17, never went. Albert's Sarah went. King Edward was in London then. Albert and Sarah did well and could afford to go. When Edward was crowned, they made the trip. They didn't see the coronation. She was 41 and he was 46 at the time. They had 2 or 3 children. I don't know what happened to them. Albert liked to hunt, but he couldn't get much because the ground was too rocky. Deer and rabbits, a special kind of rabbit, no big tails, gray hairs of some kind, and there were gray squirrels. Then the images dispersed, and for a very brief moment there seemed to be a gray fog, and through it I seemed to see the town in a still more distant past. The town had been there for at least 350 years. I told you the name before, Lemonshire. Before that, it had been a different name. There were invasions. A lot of them came along the coast earlier, the Norsemen and, I guess, the Gauls. The Gauls looked French, swarthy, and they were little men. Everyone knows what the Norsemen look like. Then suddenly I was back again, seeing the later time. In London, I don't know why, Albert's wife liked to go to the bakery shops. They had fancier breads there than in the village. And Sarah, the first one, if she hadn't burned to death, would have died anyhow at 17 of tuberculosis. One lung was bad. It was a bad place to live. The village wasn't sunny, and they kept the windows closed. There weren't many windows anyway. The land was so rocky, and they would build a house on a slab of rock, and it was always damp. Sarah's dress was dirty. It was woolen, a brown natural color because it wasn't dyed. It wouldn't have burned so, but it had grease on it, and the grease caught the flames. I shivered, seeing the dress catch fire and watching once again as the cobbler rolled the girl out into the street, beating at the flames. Then I seemed to be above the town again, looking down, but dimly. The descendants of the invaders lived in the village too. There was the Lavierne family, and de Nage, and the Breams. They slept on hay. It was so damp and gothy, and the hay was never dry. It was quiet again. Rob didn't know exactly what to do, so he just asked the first question that came into his head. Were the people happy? That's a silly question, I retorted, but with a great impartiality. It didn't seem that it was me replying at all. They were as happy as anyone else then. They didn't like their babies dying, but they just thought that was life. They drank a lot. Most of them couldn't read. Well, the sexton could some, not much. People didn't think it was necessary. They didn't have books, so what good did it do to learn to read? A few could write their names, but usually they couldn't read other people's names. They didn't have water to drink. There was salt in the ocean. That's why they washed there. But they thought that drinking water was unhealthy. It was hilly and rocky behind the village, but there was a stream up there, and they went up with horses and buckets. But they didn't drink the water. They drank ale. They made soups from the water, though, and they were lucky that the stream came down from a high place. Otherwise they'd have to dig down too far. They boiled the water for soups. This killed a lot of the germs, so they were actually healthier than other communities who had more water, since a good deal of it was polluted. They used natural liquids from animals when they made stews. I stopped. Suddenly all of it was gone. I told Rob, and he switched the lights on. That was something, I said. Did I somehow go back in space and time? Or did I hallucinate the entire episode? What did it feel like? What do you think about it? I don't know, I said. I saw so much, so clearly, and I seemed to change position in the air or in space, though I knew I was there, in this room. Could I have seen an old movie when I was a child, forgotten it, and then hallucinated scenes from it, all without knowing? It's certainly possible, Rob said. Even that would show the mind's fantastic abilities. But I have something to tell you, too. Just before you got started, I had a vision of my own. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. I couldn't. Just as it vanished, you started to go into the English thing. Well, what did you see? Well, I saw the feet of a man. He was walking along a flat, dusty, reddish road. I think he was barefoot, though now I wonder about some kind of rudimentary sandal. He had a brownish, long robe flapping about the calves of his legs. The legs were thin. What was his face like? I asked. Rob grinned. I couldn't see his head, shoulders, or even waist. The land was very flat, reds and browns. There was nothing in the far distance on the left, beyond the feet. For a moment, though, I thought I saw a group of pyramids far ahead on the horizon to the right. They were in cool, brilliant color, blues or greens. I couldn't see the bases of these, though, and I'm not even sure they were pyramids. But I saw the soles of the man's feet, wrinkled and brown, and, yes, without shoes, lifting after each stride. They were covered with dust. My experience was great, I said, but it was something like a moving picture I was looking at from a crazy angle. The scenes would change too. I'd be looking at the main street, and then suddenly I'd be in the hills beyond the village. Not really there like I'm in this room now, but partially floating. Very dim at times, but your vision was quicker, more limited, but very precise. I'm going to do a sketch or painting of it, Rob said. The colors were terrific. Do you know who the man was? I asked. I'll ask Seth, Rob said, smiling. Or maybe he wasn't anyone. I wonder if my own town was real. To me it was. Then isn't that enough for now? Rob said. I nodded. At the very least there was enough material for a good short story on the whole thing, I thought. Yet the village and the scenes lingered in my memory. We've only been involved in this stuff a little over a month, I said. I'm content for now. But we're going to have to try and check some of this out if it keeps on. We will. Don't worry about that. In the meantime, it is what it is, Rob said. Yeah, but is it what it is? Like Willie our cat is? Rob began to laugh. That's part of the fun of it, he said. Finding out. End. Number 3. Thank you, Jane Roberts and Robert F. Butts. Peace, light, and love. Aloha.